US Secretary of State Antony Blinken recently visited China, and there were talks of a thaw between these countries. Now, US President Joe Biden calls his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping a dictator. What exactly is happening here? South Korea has given environmental clearance for permanent deployment of the US THAAD missile system. Why is this controversial? And European Union officials were recently in Tunisia offering some incentives for an IMF deal. But why are the left and other progressive sections opposing it? We'll be answering all these questions and more in this episode of Daily Debrief. US President Joe Biden referred to Chinese President Xi Jinping as a dictator at a fundraising event recently. The Chinese were not amused, calling these comments extremely absurd and irresponsible. The comments are all the more curious considering that US Secretary of State Antony Blinken was just in China. In fact, he's not even returned from his trip. There's been all this talk of a possible thaw between these countries, and even Biden made positive comments recently. So what explains these snarky comments? We have with us Anish. Anish, it's all a bit confusing for many observers. And Antony Blinken goes to China. There's a lot of talks about it. There's a lot of buzz about it. You spoke about it yourself on this show. And then 2 days later, Joe Biden is making these comments at a fundraiser. Very, on the one hand, very undiplomatic comments, of course, even in normal circumstances, but especially in a circumstance where tensions are running high between these countries, and it's pretty much a private fundraising event, and making comments which are snarky, kind of dismissive about a very important, the leader of a very important country. So how do we analyze this? Is this just sort of some chest thumping at a fundraising event to get some more money to say that I'm awesome, or are there some deeper levels to it?
Well, there is a certain argument to say that it is a great deal of chest thumping on the part of Joe Biden. If you look at the language itself of the comment, where he says that he shot down as if he privately sent a fighter jet and shot down the balloon itself, and apparently he retrieved two fright cars worth of spy machines and spy equipment. Shows that it is like the level of exaggeration and chest thumping is basically something that we usually expect out of Trump. But obviously, this is Biden that we are talking about. That it clearly shows that this is that the whole point was to just impress the people that he was addressing at the fundraiser. But the fact is that he was pretty much undoing something that the entire state of the United States, the foreign policy machinery, was actually worked on for months, actually. And while a lot of people on our side of reporting did expect some level of undoing happening from the US side, especially with some kind of dismissive comment or maybe some kind of move that they suddenly insist on some level of principle on some matters. Nobody expected that something like this would happen so fast, to be very honest, because this was barely 24 hours after the meeting was concluded, and the fact that it really just completely undid every kind of goodwill that was generated during the talks, when there was certain avenues and certain grounds that both sides actually agreed on. The fact that they need to continue trade without any fetters, that they need to continue movement of people, culture, science, and technology, and the fact that they agreed on that at a time when tensions are high, that there was a visit by the Secretary of State after 5 years. All of that, like, it's quite a significant achievement considering how things are right now. But all of that just came crashing down just because the president chose to, make some kind of bombastic statements during a fundraiser, and that clearly shows how serious the US is at some level, or the US administration and the top leadership of the US administration is about peace. Because for them, as long as they can get some brownie points back home with all this chest thumping, they're definitely going. They would rather choose war rather than actual diplomatic solutions to a very problematic relationship.
Right. I'll come to that, Nish, but before that, also curious about the balloon, because when the balloon incident first happened, the United States seemed to indicate that from Xi Jinping to say maybe some random operator somewhere, the whole of the Chinese security establishment was guiding the balloon. and now it's like he didn't. Xi Jinping didn't even know there was a balloon, and he was embarrassed. So, what exactly is the U.S. position on the question of the balloon?
let's to be fair, the US never stated an actual position, and the only position it ever had was that the balloon was some kind of spy aircraft, and that's it. That's pretty much it. We do not know anything other than that about what they retrieved from the debris, what they actually found among the remains of the balloon that they thought was a spy equipment. Nevertheless, this probably is also the first time that the first citizen of the U.S. is admitting to the fact that probably the balloon, went off course and veered into their territory. It's not a very clear admission. Obviously, they're continuing this whole. It is obviously compensated by this exaggeration that we apparently found boxcars full of spy equipment. It clearly shows that the top administration really just has no idea what the whole balloon incident was about and how they're going to. So definitely, we do not know what the stand is. But in this case, they're just continuing on, making random statements. I mean, like some level, we do expect that from Biden, considering how much control he has had over the course of his administration on his own foreign policy. But in this case, definitely, this clearly, it clearly shows how much of the entire incident was just a, you know, a big hot air balloon actually that went down in all this rhetoric, comedy that we can think of. And that is pretty much what it was. And they pretty much do not give us details because they do not have anything. But at this point, they are giving us some snippets of what they did understand, which was the fact that the balloon veered off into their territory and it was not controlled. But obviously, the reporting at the time was completely different.
But Anish, going into the larger question, also I think you mentioned it in the first question, that sort of divergence of policies and perspective towards peace, right? In the sense that which has happened time and again. You impose sanctions, then you say that you want to talk about peace. You say you want to talk about peace as a Chinese official. Then you lecture them. Blinken goes to Beijing. This happens. So, is there a fundamental lack of clarity within the US itself about whether they do want peace with China?
Well, I think the lack of clarity stems from the fact that the United States, the whole, not just the foreign policy machinery, the diplomatic machinery, but also its military-industrial complex and the capitalist class really do not know what they have to do with China at this moment. And this is something that has been observed by several anti-imperialist and leftist and progressive groups around the world, because the US policy towards China pretty much is devoid at the moment, is devoid of any kind of clarity, not just clarity, but also any kind of grounds. It at one point it says that it will support the one China policy, but then goes ahead and makes laws after laws, and even creates mechanisms for arms trade with a territory that they do not recognize by any means. And it's just this is pretty much just an extension. All of this is just an extension. Right. It's completely confused, primarily because it really does not understand how to deal with it, because they definitely cannot do it. At one point, obviously, you've seen earlier this year, last month, you saw how they wanted all its allies to dealing. It was something that the US was talking about during the G7 meet, to dealing from China, or to at least cut down, production chains from China.
They call it de-risking, though.
Yeah, de-risking, exactly. And then now they're saying like de-linking is completely unacceptable. It's not practical. So you have one set of officials saying one thing, and then you have the other set who do not really. So there is this problematic lack of linkage and like lack of coherence between the entire policy measure that US wants to impose on China, because as I said, like at risk of reiterating, it doesn't really know how to deal with a power that is not like itself. It's like, as much as the rhetoric and the propaganda goes ahead of trying to present China as a sort of imperialistic superpower, China is not that. It really does not impose its will on other nations. It does not create very impossible conditionalities for trade or any kind of financial transactions with other countries. And it actually does have a beneficial role in the third world, unlike the United States. So it doesn't understand how to deal with a country like this that has very different view of how to conduct business in the current multipolar world. And it is pretty much like also the part of a sort of desperation of US losing its supremacy as a multipolar world also emerges at this point in time.
Absolutely. Right. Of course, in normal course, one would be anywhere between amused and serves them right for the kind of internal chaos that takes place in the United States. But this has concrete impact for people across the world because, the kind of, when you have so many warships and bases, you don't want confusion and chaos reigning inside a country. But stay back with us. We'll come back to you for a very connected story in some senses soon. We're staying with the US and its global tentacles, this time in South Korea. The East Asian country recently gave environmental clearance for the permanent deployment of the Terminal High Altitude Air Defense, it's quite a mouthful, or THAAD missile system of the US. Now, this has been controversial both in the community where it was earlier deployed and with China. In fact, China had even imposed punitive measures in South Korea. We return to Anish to understand why these systems are being deployed. So Anish, from a non-existent military basis to an actual instance of a US missile system, a defense system, that THAAD deployed in South Korea. So maybe before we go into the politics of it, could you just give us a quick idea of what this system is in the first place?
So the THAAD has existed in South Korea for a while now. At least 9 batteries of in the US missile system actually are deployed in South Korea. So it is nothing new. But what has always been the issue is that the new upgraded version, which includes an extensive and powerful radar system, was something that not just North Korea, the immediate neighbor for South Korea, but also China raised concerns about, because, and this is quite ironic because we talked about the spy balloon earlier, but the fact that the United States has no qualms about sending extremely high level military grade radar systems and reconnaissance systems to other countries, but does not want even a weather balloon in its territory, shows the kind of hypocrisy. But yeah, so this is pretty much what China has raised concerns over for for over a year now, ever since the UN government has actually, and it was part of his political campaign, his election campaign as well, that he would expand the system. And the primary basis of expanding the system right now would be to actually link it with the patriotic missile system, creating a sort of a unified US, basically US led, but technically on paper it is US South Korea managed missile system that will cover that will give an umbrella coverage for not just South Korea but also its close allies in the region like Japan. So this sort of linking of multiple powerful missile systems has always been a matter of concern for all everybody involved. It was not just like even earlier Russia had issues with it, but obviously it has not given a clear-cut statement at this point. But China has clearly doubled down on that statement, the fact that its concerns are quite valid, and the fact that it will probably go with sanctions that we saw in 2017 when there was a similar sort of policy of expanding the missile system, and there were certain level of sanctions, including in cultural exchanges between the two countries. So that is pretty much the situation where we are at now between the two countries at the point.
Right, Anish, of course, this is not a new development. We've been, in fact, very consistently on the show talking about developments in the Asia-Pacific region and East Asia, both Japan and South Korea drastically moving towards extensive collaboration with the US on the issue of defense, of course. And I think very clearly making a statement that this is a conflict zone. I don't think peace is really on the agenda here. They're really ramping up the defense establishments of these countries, defense cooperation between these countries, and even in Southeast Asia for that matter. So how do you sort of see the arc of this development in the light of recent events and kind of statements that are being made?
Yeah, I think as much as we keep risking reiterating ourselves, but there has always been, like for at least several years now, at least since the Trump administration's policy towards China, we have seen a sort of encirclement policy against China, targeting China. And that has always been the case. Now, the thing is, like, you have a constellation of very pro US governments in the region that are quite keen on militarizing themselves. We have Kishida in Japan. We have right now Yoon in South Korea, and obviously Marcos Jr. in Philippines, all of whom have actually, right now expanded U.S. presence in the region, and and even brought it into conflicts or disputes, territorial disputes, where U.S. really has no business in, like neither any claim or a validity of being part of it. But yeah, so this entire problem is that they're creating sort of points of conflict and tensions across the region, where if one doesn't work out, there will be another one that will create. So it's basically a chain of tensions where one move by either side would actually create a diplomatic problem across the region, and that is something we've seen in Taiwan. We are now right now seeing in Southeast Asia, and the South China Sea dispute, especially with Philippines. So this is not new, but obviously the fact that, like, the multiple concerns that countries like China and maybe North Korea, and also countries in Southeast Asia, many of whom do not want to take a side on this issue. We've seen ASEAN wanting to, like Indonesia-led ASEAN wanting to take away its joint military drills away from the South China Sea, shows that they really do not want to be involved in this conflict right now, and clearly keeping out of it, being very concerned about this rising tensions in the region. A region, as I've said before, also wasn't known for such high levels of tension since the Vietnam War, or for that matter, the Korean War. This is the kind of tensions that we expect of countries just preparing for war, but that is pretty much how it is. Japan is militarizing, South Korea is also militarizing, but both of them are not doing on their own. They're doing it in collaboration with the United States, with expansion of U.S. presence in the region, and that is something that is going to tip the balance, or of whatever kind of peace that existed between nations in the region, despite the conflicts that they've had, ideological and territorial.
Absolutely, Anish. Of course, in some senses, I guess the US also trying to reverse policies of integration which many of these countries have been working on. For instance, like RCEP, which really brought all these economies in terms of trade and coming closer. And I think these two divergent approaches really standing out in examples such as these, where the THAAD missile systems are being dragged all the way to South Korea for no real purpose. It seems very clear. Thank you so much for talking to us. We'll come back to you soon in future episodes as well, hopefully with less bleak news. And finally, EU officials were in Tunisia, and one of the key topics for discussion was the question of refugees. Now, we know that EU officials like to express sympathy for refugees, but do nothing while they die at sea. But sometimes they also go a step further, and this means leaning on countries in Africa to do their dirty work. And how is that? By detaining refugees and stopping them by any means possible. A lot of refugees tried to get to Europe from Tunisia, and it seems like European leaders have found a good way to bring Tunisian President Kais Saied to their side. An IMF deal. We have with us Abdul here to talk about this. Abdul, welcome back to the show. So, EU officials visiting Tunisia and having these discussions. Now, there are two questions here. There's the question of migration, and there's also the question of the IMF deal. So, from the reports that we've received, what kind of an offer have these officials made to Tunisia?
Well, Italian Prime Minister clearly stated during her press conference after her meeting with Said on June 11 that if the other agreements stands, you will basically facilitate Tunisia's bid to $1.5 billion IMF loan. So it is quite clear that they are promising that if Tunisia agrees to what they are basically offering, they will help Tunisia to get the loan, because we know that Tunisia has been reluctant to implement the IMF conditionalities, which basically means reduction of the subsidies, food subsidies in particular. Apart from food and fuel subsidies, there are other privatization and divestment and other conditions. And Saeed has been quite reluctant to do that, given the fact that he is already very popular after July 2000. July 2021 political coup. So he does not want to take the risk. But the Tunisian economy, it seems, that is what the calculation says, needs that around $2 billion loan. So given all these situation, I think Europeans have read it quite well, and they think that Saeed is
in a vulnerable position.
And he can be pushed to implement their agenda related to the control of the movement of migrants.
Right. So, Abdul, let's go a bit deeper into this question of migrants. So, what really is the EU asking Tunisia? Because we understand that a number of countries have been, faced such offers from the EU to basically stall the migration.
Exactly. In fact, Turkey had signed a deal in 2016 with the European countries. Libya faction, though there is no central government in Libya, there are different factions who have been provided money and equipments, boats and etc. to control the movement of migrants. So as per the AP's report, apart from the IMF loan deal, the EU has also offered $100 million extra to basically help build a border guard in Tunisia, provide them boats, provide them other equipments to basically apprehend any kind of movement from the Tunisian coast. As we all know, there have been several reports which basically claim that a large number of boats carrying migrants across the Mediterranean originates in Tunisia, primarily since February this year, when Kais Saied's racist utterances against migrants from sub-Saharan Africa and other migrants in the region. So they are planning to build an infrastructure in Tunisia, as they have, though it is not at par with what was there in Turkey, of course, because of the different economic conditions and so on and so forth. But they are planning to build an infrastructure in Tunisia, which basically will prevent, the Tunisian government will apprehend all quote-unquote illegal migrants and will take the responsibility of deportation and other thing. So though the details of it are not yet clear, but this is the initial assessment of the proposal which European countries want to do. That will mean, as the human rights organizations and the Tunisian Worker Party and other have apprehended, have feared that this will lead to further increase of human right violations. It will also lead to, in fact, already the accidents are increasing. It may lead to escalation.
Because refugees might seek more desperate methods to cross.
Exactly.
But Abdul, European leaders and in fact leaders of the global north tend to refer to, reduce this problem to one of smuggling, and then they say that they have this noble ambition, which is that we want to stop the smuggling of, poor refugees and migrants, and that is why we are deploying all this force. But I think it's far more complicated than that.
Of course, it is much more complicated. There are larger economic, political, social repercussions which a large number of European countries are not willing to face, despite the fact that this is primarily, the migration and the refugee crisis is primarily their creation. As Tunisian Worker Party claims, and I think this is a well-known fact already, that most of the colonial policies adopted by European countries and the US has created economic crisis in most of the global south, and a large number of, and wars, of course, and the people, those who are trying to escape these situations, Europeans are not taking the responsibility. Right. So there is a larger complex issue involved here.
Right.
And it is not only related to the human trafficking, alleged human trafficking.
Absolutely. And not to mention, of course, many of these European leaders like to present this as an example of their strong anti-refugee credentials or security credentials.
Exactly.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Abdul, for talking to us. A very complicated issue, like you said. The leaders, of course, refusing to go into the deeper structural issues of this crisis. You have been covering it extensively. We'll come back to you for such issues soon. And that's all we have for Daily Debrief. Please visit our website, peoplesdispatch.org. Follow us on all the social media accounts of your choice. Watch our videos on YouTube, and we'll see you tomorrow.